Dan Morgan had never been one for garage sales, but on this particular Saturday morning, something drew him to the small table set up at the end of Briarwood Lane. He had taken his usual morning walk, a routine he clung to since retiring from his factory job, and the sign for the garage sale, barely legible in its faded blue paint, caught his attention. The house itself was nothing special. A rundown two-story Victorian, probably built in the late 1800s, with peeling white paint and overgrown weeds climbing up the foundation. It looked like the kind of place that had long since been abandoned, yet here it was, advertising a sale. Dan was a practical man. He had no need for more knickknacks, but curiosity pulled him closer. As he approached the rickety table, he spotted the usual array of old magazines, a few chipped porcelain plates, and some yellowed books. Then he saw the lamp. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Tall and slender, with a brass base that looked tarnished with age, but somehow still elegant. The lampshade was a deep burgundy, made from a fabric that seemed out of place in today's world, like something that belonged in a different time. Dan couldn't explain why he wanted it. He didn't need another lamp. But this one felt different. It was as if the lamp was staring back at him, drawing him in with its quiet presence. "How much for the lamp?" Dan asked the woman sitting in a creaky lawn chair behind the table. She was elderly, her gray hair tied back in a loose bun, her face lined with the years she'd seen. Her eyes flickered to the lamp, and for a moment Dan thought he saw hesitation. Then she smiled, a slow, weary smile that didn't reach her eyes. $5, she said. Dan reached for his wallet, the feeling of unease growing in the back of his mind. He handed her the money and took the lamp, its weight heavier than he expected. As he carried it home, that strange sensation lingered, like he wasn't alone. Like the lamp itself was more than just an object. He pushed the thought aside. It was just a lamp, nothing more. Dan placed the lamp in his living room, next to his favorite armchair. He lived alone, his wife having passed away 3 years earlier, and his daughter Sarah had moved across the country for a job. The house had been too quiet since then, too empty. Maybe that's why the lamp felt like a good idea. A little something to change the atmosphere, to break up the monotony. The first night was peaceful enough. Dan fell asleep in his chair, the lamp casting a warm glow over the room. When he woke in the morning, everything seemed normal, though he couldn't shake the sense that something was off. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to old age. But over the next few days, the odd occurrences began. It started small, barely noticeable things. He would set his keys down on the kitchen counter, only to find them later in the living room. His reading glasses, which he always kept on the side table by his chair, would somehow end up in the hallway. At first, Dan figured he was just being forgetful. He was getting older, after all. Then, the noises began. In the middle of the night, Dan would wake up to the sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking slowly through the house. He would lie in bed, heart pounding, listening as the footsteps moved from room to room. But every time he got up to check, the house was empty. Just the house settling, he told himself. Old houses make noises. But the footsteps grew louder, more frequent, and then came the whispers. At first, they were faint. So faint that Dan thought it was his imagination. But as the days passed, the whispers became clearer, though he couldn't make out the words. They seemed to be coming from the lamp, but every time he got close enough to listen, they stopped. Dan was no longer sleeping well. He became jumpy, startled by every creak and groan the house made. He couldn't explain it, but the lamp, something was wrong with it. He tried moving it to different rooms, hoping the strange occurrences would stop, but it didn't matter. The whispers followed the lamp, and so did the footsteps. One evening, Dan invited his daughter Sarah over for dinner. He hadn't mentioned the lamp or the strange things that had been happening. He didn't want to worry her. But as they sat in the living room, talking about Sarah's work and life, Dan noticed her glancing at the lamp. "Dad, where did you get that?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Garage sale down the street," Dan said. "Why?" Sarah shook her head. "It's just, I don't know. There's something about it that gives me the creeps." Dan felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "I can't explain it," Sarah said, standing up to inspect the lamp. "It just feels wrong." Dan didn't say anything, but he could feel it too. The wrongness. It had been growing ever since he brought the lamp into the house. A constant creeping sensation that something was watching him. That night, after Sarah left, Dan sat in his armchair, staring at the lamp. He knew he needed to get rid of it. Whatever was happening, it had to be connected to the lamp. But every time he thought about throwing it away, a strange resistance welled up inside him, like the lamp didn't want to be discarded. As he sat there, the whispers started again, louder this time. Dan could hear his name being called, soft and insistent. He closed his eyes, willing the voices to stop, but they only grew louder. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move. Dan's eyes snapped open, and he turned to the lamp. In the dim light, he saw a shadowy figure standing just beyond the edge of the lampshade. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, watching him. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the figure, frozen in place. Slowly, the figure began to move, stepping closer to the lamp. Dan wanted to run, but his legs refused to cooperate. The figure reached the lamp and disappeared. Dan bolted out of his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table, his eyes never leaving the lamp. It was just a trick of the light, he told himself. It had to be. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something was in the house, and it had come with the lamp. Over the next few weeks, Dan's life became a waking nightmare. The footsteps and whispers never ceased, and the shadowy figure appeared more often, always lingering near the lamp. It seemed to be growing stronger, more solid, as if feeding off Dan's fear. Sleep became impossible. Every time Dan closed his eyes, he would hear the voices calling his name, beckoning him toward the lamp. The house, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison, one that he couldn't escape. He stopped going out, stopped calling Sarah. He didn't want her involved, didn't want to risk whatever was in the house getting to her. The lamp was his problem, and he had to deal with it. One night, after an especially terrifying encounter with the shadowy figure, Dan made up his mind. He was going to destroy the lamp. Whatever it was, whatever had come with it, it had to be stopped. He grabbed a hammer from the garage, his hands trembling as he approached the lamp. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but Dan ignored them. He raised the hammer, ready to smash the lamp to pieces. But before he could bring it down, the lights flickered and went out. Dan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow coming from the lamp. And in that glow, the shadowy figure appeared once again, this time more solid than ever. It moved toward Dan, slow and deliberate, its features becoming clearer as it approached. It had no face, no eyes, but Dan could feel it watching him. Paralyzed with fear, Dan dropped the hammer. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and placed them on the lamp. Suddenly, the room was filled with light. Bright, blinding light that made Dan shield his eyes. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, filling his ears with a cacophony of voices. And then, just as quickly as it started, the light and the voices stopped. Dan blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden darkness. The lamp was gone. The figure was gone. The house was silent. For the first time in weeks, Dan felt a sense of peace. Whatever had been haunting him, whatever had come with the lamp, it was over. Or so he thought. The days following the disappearance of the lamp were eerily quiet. The footsteps, whispers, and shadowy figure were gone, and Dan felt like he could finally breathe again. He even called Sarah, apologizing for his distance and inviting her over for dinner. But the peace didn't last. One night, as Dan sat in his armchair reading, he noticed something strange out of the corner of his eye. A faint glow, just barely visible, coming from the hallway. His heart raced as he stood up, following the light to its source. It was coming from the spare bedroom, the room where he had first placed the lamp. Dan hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He didn't want to open the door. He didn't want to see what was waiting for him on the other side. But he had no choice. He opened the door and stepped inside. The lamp was there, sitting on the nightstand, glowing softly in the dark. And standing next to it was the shadowy figure. Dan's heart pounded in his chest as the figure turned to face him. This time there was no mistaking it. The figure was real. It had form, substance, and it was coming for him. The whispers began again, louder and more insistent than ever. They called his name over and over, beckoning him closer to the lamp. Dan backed away, his hands shaking. He had to get out. He had to leave the house, but the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. The figure stepped closer, its faceless head tilting as if studying him. Dan could feel its presence, cold, malevolent, suffocating. It raised its hand, reaching for him. Dan screamed. When Sarah arrived at the house the next morning, she found the front door unlocked. Her father hadn't answered her calls, and she was worried. She stepped inside, calling out his name, but the house was silent. She found him in the spare bedroom, sitting in the armchair by the window. The lamp was gone, and so was the shadowy figure. But Dan was dead, his face twisted in terror, his eyes wide open as if he had seen something too horrible to comprehend. Sarah called the police, but they couldn't explain what had happened. There was no sign of foul play, no indication of a struggle. It was as if Dan had simply stopped. The house was sold a few months later, and Sarah moved on with her life. But she never forgot the lamp or the strange feeling she had the last time she saw it. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear whispers, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. They called her name, just like they had called her father's. And in the corner of her bedroom, where the shadows gathered the deepest, she could swear she saw a faint glow.
Widow's Peak was a cliff that jutted out over the tumultuous waves of the Atlantic Ocean, a place known for its dramatic views and its tragic history. It was said that in the early 1800s, the wives of sailors who lived in the nearby coastal village would gather there, scanning the horizon for any sign of their husbands' ships. Many of those women waited in vain, as the sea was unforgiving, and not all vessels returned from their perilous journeys. One such woman, Lillian Morris, became a symbol of sorrow and loss. Her husband, Captain William Morris, was a seasoned sailor who promised to return to her after his latest voyage. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and no word came from his ship. Lillian visited the peak every day, no matter the weather, waiting, hoping. Eventually, her hope turned to despair, and one stormy night, she was seen standing at the edge of the cliff, her white nightgown billowing in the wind. The next morning, her body was found on the rocks below. The villagers claimed that her ghost still lingered at Widow's Peak, eternally waiting for her lost love. It became a local legend, a ghost story passed down through generations. Many said they had seen her, a pale figure standing at the cliff's edge, her eyes fixed on the sea. Some even claimed to hear her wailing on stormy nights, her cries carried on the wind. For years, no one ventured to Widow's Peak after dark, until a group of amateur ghost hunters decided to investigate. Among them was Tom, a skeptic who had never believed in ghosts but was intrigued by the stories of Lillian's haunting. The group planned to spend the night at the cliff, hoping to capture evidence of the widow's ghost. They arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, the ocean below crashing against the rocks with a rhythmic, thunderous roar. The cliff itself was eerily quiet, save for the wind that howled through the craggy rocks and the distant calls of seabirds. The group set up their equipment, cameras, voice recorders, and EMF detectors, and settled in for what they assumed would be a long, uneventful night. As darkness fell, the wind picked up, carrying with it the salty scent of the sea. Tom, standing near the edge of the cliff, stared out at the water, wondering what it must have been like for Lillian to wait here night after night, hoping for a ship that would never come. He could almost imagine her standing there, her white nightgown flapping in the wind, her eyes full of sorrow. "I don't get why people think this place is haunted," Tom said, turning to his friends. "It's just a cliff. There's nothing here." But even as he spoke, a chill ran down his spine. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and the wind seemed to take on a new, more ominous tone. The others noticed it too, exchanging uneasy glances. "Do you hear that?" one of them asked. Tom strained his ears, listening. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it, faint, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. A soft, mournful wail carried on the breeze. "It's just the wind," Tom said, though his voice lacked confidence. The wail grew louder, more distinct, as if someone, or something, was crying out from the depths of the ocean. The group huddled closer together, their flashlights scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The cliff, once silent and still, now seemed alive with an unsettling energy. The waves crashed harder against the rocks below, the wind howled through the cracks in the cliffs, and the wail grew louder still, echoing around them. Suddenly, one of the EMF detectors lit up, the needle spiking into the red. The group froze, their eyes wide with fear. The temperature continued to drop, and the air grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating feeling. Tom's heart raced as he tried to stay rational. "It's probably just electrical interference," he muttered, though even he didn't believe it anymore. Then, from the shadows at the far end of the cliff, a figure appeared. At first, it was little more than a faint outline, a pale shape against the dark night sky. But as it moved closer, the group could make out the details. A woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her hair whipping around her face in the wind. She walked slowly, her head bowed, as if weighed down by sorrow. Her feet seemed to barely touch the ground, and her movements were unnaturally smooth, almost as if she were floating. Tom felt his breath catch in his throat. It couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light or a prank. But as the figure drew nearer, there was no denying what they were seeing. "Is that her?" one of the others whispered, their voice trembling. The woman in white stopped at the edge of the cliff, her back to the group, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She stood there perfectly still, her white gown fluttering in the wind. The wailing stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. No one moved, no one spoke. They simply stared, transfixed, as the ghostly figure of Lillian Morris waited, just as she had done all those years ago. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he should feel afraid, but there was something else, something deeper, more profound. Sadness. The figure before him wasn't a monster or a malevolent spirit. She was a woman, trapped in a never-ending cycle of grief, forever waiting for someone who would never return. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the ghost turned. Her face, pale and gaunt, was streaked with tears. Her eyes, hollow and filled with despair, locked onto Tom's. For a brief moment, he felt as though he could see into her soul, into the endless sorrow that had consumed her. The wind picked up again, howling louder than before, and the ghost of Lillian Morris let out one final piercing wail, a cry so filled with anguish that it made Tom's heart ache. The figure stepped forward, as if she were about to walk right off the edge of the cliff. And then she vanished. The group stood in stunned silence, the air around them still vibrating with the energy of what they had just witnessed. Tom's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had seen, but there was no logical explanation. The ghost of Widow's Peak was real. They packed up their equipment in a daze, too shaken to speak. As they made their way back to the village, the wind began to die down, and the wailing faded into the distance, as if the spirit of Lillian Morris had returned to the sea. Tom never forgot that night. He had gone to Widow's Peak a skeptic, but he left a believer, haunted not by fear, but by the overwhelming sadness of a woman who had waited for her love in life, and now in death.
Hawthorne Hollow was once a vibrant town, nestled deep within a forest at the edge of nowhere. But now it lay abandoned, overgrown, and forgotten. The townsfolk had left long ago, driven out by a series of tragic and inexplicable events that no one could explain. But the few that remained behind, the elders of nearby villages spoke in hushed tones about the children of Hawthorne Hollow, a group of children who had mysteriously vanished one summer evening and were never seen again. It started with the whispers, they said. Children in the town would complain about hearing voices in the woods surrounding the town. The whispers called their names, soft at first, barely noticeable. Parents dismissed them as the imaginations of overactive children. But as more and more of them reported hearing the voices, a quiet unease settled over the town. The children also began to act strangely. They would stare out into the distance as if watching something invisible, their faces blank, their eyes unfocused. They spoke less and less, and when they did speak, it was only in cryptic, disjointed sentences that made no sense. "They're calling us," they would say, "the ones in the woods." No one knew who or what the children were talking about. Then came the night when they disappeared, all of them. Every child in Hawthorne Hollow vanished without a trace. Some were taken from their beds, others from the streets, and a few were last seen walking toward the edge of the forest. The town searched frantically for them, but they were never found. Days turned into weeks, and the grief-stricken parents gave up hope. Eventually, the town emptied as the remaining families fled, unable to bear the weight of the unsolved mystery. Decades later, the story of the children of Hawthorne Hollow had become little more than a ghost story, a cautionary tale told around campfires. But for Max, a journalist who specialized in uncovering local legends, the story was too intriguing to pass up. He had heard about the Hollow from a local historian, and after some research, he decided to investigate for himself. Max arrived in Hawthorne Hollow just before dusk. The town was a ruin, overgrown with vines and weeds, its buildings crumbling and its streets cracked and broken. The hollow was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The air was thick with the scent of decay and damp earth, and a feeling of unease settled over Max as he ventured deeper into the abandoned town. He made his way to the town square, where the remains of an old fountain sat in the center. Max pulled out his camera and began to document the ruins, hoping to capture something, anything, that might explain what had happened here all those years ago. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest that surrounded the town seemed to come alive with a strange energy. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees in a way that sent a shiver down Max's spine. He glanced around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Then he heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind. At first, Max thought it was the rustling of leaves, but then he heard it again, a soft, distant voice. His heart raced as he strained to listen, but the voice was gone. He shook his head, chalking it up to nerves. He had been on many investigations before, and he knew how easy it was to let fear get the better of him. But as he continued to explore the town, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The wind picked up again, and this time, there was no mistaking it. The voice was back, whispering, calling. Max froze. It sounded like a child. He scanned the area, his flashlight flickering in the dim light, but he saw no one. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Max," it whispered. Max's blood ran cold. How did it know his name? He took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, and Max's instincts screamed at him to leave. But he didn't. Instead, he followed the voice, moving deeper into the hollow. The houses seemed to loom over him, their windows dark and empty, like the hollow eyes of a skull. The further he went, the stronger the whispers became, until it felt as though the air itself was alive with the sound of children's voices, overlapping and echoing in a disorienting chorus. "Max!" "Come, play with us." The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill through Max's body. He wanted to turn back, to run, but some unseen force pulled him forward, guiding him toward the edge of the forest that bordered the town. As he approached the tree line, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. Standing there, just beyond the trees, were children, dozens of them. Their pale faces were barely visible in the dim light, but their eyes, dark, hollow, and expressionless, stared directly at him. Max stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest. The children stood motionless, their faces blank, their bodies eerily still. And then, as one, they smiled. It was not the innocent smile of a child. It was something else, something darker, twisted. Before Max could react, the children turned and disappeared into the woods, their laughter echoing behind them. Max stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The rational part of his mind told him to leave, to get out of there before it was too late. But his curiosity overpowered his fear. He followed them into the forest. The trees were dense, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as Max pushed his way through the underbrush, his flashlight flickering with each step. The laughter of the children echoed all around him, distant and close at the same time, leading him deeper into the woods. And then he saw it. A clearing, bathed in an unnatural light. In the center of the clearing stood an old, crumbling well, its stone walls covered in moss and vines. The children were there, standing around the well in a perfect circle, their eyes fixed on Max as he approached. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The children didn't move, didn't speak. They simply stared, their faces blank, their eyes empty. Then, one by one, they stepped forward, disappearing into the well. Max watched in horror as each child vanished into the dark, bottomless pit, their ghostly forms swallowed by the shadows. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the voices blending together in a maddening cacophony. Max wanted to run, to turn back, but he couldn't move. And then, the last child, the smallest of them all, turned to him, her hollow eyes locking onto his. "Come play with us," she whispered. Before Max could react, the girl stepped forward, her small hand reaching out to him. The darkness of the well seemed to stretch out, pulling at him, tugging him toward the abyss. And then, everything went black. When Max was found the next morning, he was lying at the edge of the clearing, unconscious and covered in dirt. He had no memory of how he had escaped the forest, but the look in his eyes told the story. The children of Hawthorne Hollow were still waiting, and they were always looking for new playmates.